And I'm sorry I'm late. I mixed up the time zone, which is a real rookie mistake to make. But I did it. I thought it was. My apologies. And I'm just going to make sure my. Let me just make sure I've got my. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, everything's good. Thank you. I was sitting here panicking that we're counting down to 7 o'clock, and I'm glad we're all here, and I'm happy for the 46 people with us today to talk about this. So I'm just going to do a short introduction, and then I'm going to leave it up to you, Ian. My name is Mark Neuhengen.
And I can screen.
I am the Director of Evangelization and Parish Ministry at St. Teresa of Avila Catholic Parish in Chicago, Illinois. We have people joining us today all the way from, well, Ian, I'll let you talk about it, but Ian's joining us from Singapore. We also have some people joining us from mainland China as well as other places around the world. St. Teresa is hosting a few different events over the year. Actually, tomorrow we have our next big event that you might have saw when you logged on. We have Becoming Anti-Racist. We're having 3 Jesuits, priests sharing their experience of racial justice activism Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night. So I will put that sign up in the chat if you're interested in joining. We also live stream our Mass on Sundays at 10 a.m. Central Time, Chicago time. We have about 200 people to 600 people weekly joining us from all around the world. So wherever you are in the world, I highly recommend that you join us. And so before I hand it over to Ian, I'm just going to read a short bio of who's talking to us today. Ian Johnson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer focusing on society, religion, and history. He was rewarded the 2020-2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Fellowship for a new book he is writing on China's unofficial history. Ian has been in China over the last 30 to 40 years, reporting on anything from the WTO to social issues to economics to religion. Let's see what else. His newest book, The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao, which I read a few years ago, highly recommend, describes China's religious revival and its implications for politics and society. His other books are on civil society and grassroots protest in China and Islamism and Cold War in Europe. He has also contributed chapters to My First Trip to China, Chinese Characters, and the Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China. I hope you contributed pictures to that. So I'm very thankful to Ian for taking some time out of his day to talk to us about the Catholic Church in China and whatnot. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Ian. You should have, if you're sharing your screen, you should have full privileges to do that.
Okay, great. Well, in fact, let me see, where is mine? Sorry, let me just, so I apologize for being late, and there it is. It's my I have a little PowerPoint which has some pictures, which are always, I think, sometimes fun. And there it is. Start that. Okay, so here's my sort of little slide to begin. A Tale of Two Jesuits from Mateo de Francis. This we'll explain later, but I mean, basically, what I want to do is give a rundown of the place of Catholicism in China today, a little bit of its historical background, and maybe prospects for the future, touch on the Vatican's agreement with Beijing over consecrating bishops, and then open it up for questions, because I'm sure many of you do have questions and want to discuss things. So, I mean, one of the first things I think, just to give a real basic context, is that religion in China is booming. So there's different ways of measuring religiosity. Here I have some stats that I put up there. As you can see, they're very round numbers. They're sort of almost guesstimates, but you could say 400 to 600 million regular practitioners. The biggest by far would be Buddhism, followed by Taoism, folk religion practitioners, Protestants, Muslims, and Catholics. As a percentage of the population, none of these figures is particularly large. Even the total number is less than half the population. But compared to the almost zero number of people who practiced religion in the 1970s, it's significant growth. So we have a situation in China of more and more people practicing religion, but the state still having a very large, playing a very large role in that, and therefore, and then I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, the government is not even-handed in how it deals with religion. There is support for some religions, and as I outline here, these are the ones that are so-called indigenous religions, religions that are seen as not challenging the state and that complement the secularizing narrative of the state. What do I mean by indigenous religions? Obviously, Taoism or Taoism, depending on how you write it, is seen as an indigenous religion. It was started in China and it's found primarily in Chinese communities around the world. And then Buddhism started in India, but moved to China 2,000 years ago. And the state does not see it as being problematic, that it's sort of localized. And therefore, these kind of religions, then folk religions is an amorphous grouping of different kinds of religious beliefs, such as ancestor worship, small cults and sects that you find around China. These are also seen as unchallenging to the state, that these are more easily controlled because they have a very local component. This is an example, for example, of some sort of state-sanctioned religious activity. This is a big temple fair, and people are practicing here. Looks like martial arts, but they're actually doing this for a deity. They're performing at the birth date of a deity. This gets government funding, these kinds of practices. This is, again, the same activity. Here is a Taoist temple that's being rebuilt. You have huge amount of construction at Taoist and Buddhist temples, and something that does not take place in terms of Christianity and Islam. And that is, again, because the government sees these as not so threatening, because they feel that there are not so many foreign ties. And I guess that's the key component here. If there are more foreign ties, then the government is worried about that. That's its view also toward non-governmental organizations in general. All kinds of NGOs are allowed, but not if there are too many foreign ties. So these so-called foreign faiths, which are not really foreign because they've been in China for hundreds and hundreds of years. Islam came to China shortly after it was founded, so it has a history of more than 1,000 years. And Christianity came to China, has had a permanent presence. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but for over 400 years, but it's been coming and going over the centuries. These foreign faiths have overseas ties. They're tolerated but not promoted. And life is sometimes made difficult, and then there's also outright oppression of some religious faiths. This is an unsanctioned Protestant church in rural China that was built. Obviously, the local government knew it was being built. This is a big, big structure. It was built, put up with local approval, and then the central government said, wait a minute, this does not have approval, and so they demolished the church. And this will happen from time to time because the state is trying to reassert control over society generally, and religion is seen as part of that. And here we have the demolition work on that church. Islam is practiced primarily by ethnic minorities. We've probably all read in the newspaper or heard maybe vaguely, or maybe some of you know more concretely about the situation in Xinjiang. And that's the home of Uyghurs, which is one of the Turkic ethnic minority that lives inside the borders of China. Another large Muslim group are the Hui, HUI. These two groups account for maybe 2/3, 3/4 of Muslims in China. And the government has been embarking on a forced secularization of these groups, especially the Uyghurs. And you may have heard of these re-education camps in Western China where they are sent to learn to be essentially Chinese and to be good party followers of the Communist Party. And they are discouraged from what is seen as quote unquote excessive religiosity. And that can be very basic things, very basic tenets of the Muslim faith, such as praying 5 times a day, or things that you find in many Muslim homes, a rug, say, showing the Kabbalah in Mecca on the wall, that sort of thing. That's considered to be too much. If you don't drink alcohol and you refrain from eating pork, that's seen as maybe a sign of being radical or excessively religious. And so people who follow these kinds of basic practices and tenets are being sent to these camps to be re-educated. And this has been defined by many governments as as cultural genocide. And hence you've heard probably about sanctions that have been imposed by Western countries because of the handling of especially the Uyghurs, Muslim minority group. I think they're united in the situation of Christianity in that both Abrahamic faiths are seen as having too many outside ties. Protestantism, also through the global Protestant community that often supports the Protestant church inside China, and Catholicism, of course, anyway, because it's headquartered in a foreign country, run by a foreigner, and it has aspirations to control the clergy inside China, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. Yeah, this is another shot of a big mosque in China. Many of these minarets have actually been taken down in the past year or two. I don't know specifically in this mosque, but I do know in a large mosque in Dunhuang, which is a Western Chinese small city on the Silk Road near Xinjiang in Gansu province. There's a similar sized mosque, and it had minarets taken down because it was seen as too dominating the cityscape. And they didn't want that. So this is an idea, I think, gives you a sense of the way that religion is being viewed increasingly suspicious despite this, or because of this religious revival that's going on in China. So it's a classic case of tension between a strong state that seeks to dominate almost all aspects of society and religion, which is something that's harder to control and that usually tries to have autonomous organizational structures, etc. This is a picture of one of these re-education camps for Muslims. Catholicism has a special role. It's, as I noted in my quick statistical rundown, it is probably the smallest of the established religions in China. So the government only recognizes 5 religious groups: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. So that's 5 groups, 4 religions. It's been in China longer than Protestantism. It's in some ways, I would say, more integrated, perhaps because of this history. And unlike the Protestant church, it is a hierarchically organized structure. So there is somebody at the top with whom you can make an agreement. You know, it's hard to know if you're dealing with Protestant churches who you would negotiate with. But in the case of Catholicism, you can negotiate with the Vatican. And hence there's been this agreement, which I can explain in a little more detail. the agreement on how bishops should be consecrated that the two sides agreed to a couple of years ago. As I said, it has a longer history. Catholicism has been coming and going in China for many, many centuries, for over 1,000 years. There's even pre-Catholic, there's Nestorian, or not pre-Catholic, but separate to Catholicism, there was Nestorianism that came in the Tang Dynasty, so between the years roughly 600 and 900 AD. The Jesuits made the first permanent foothold for Christianity in China when Matteo Ricci arrived in 1601. This is a tombstone of Jesuits that you can see in a cemetery in Beijing that is used to be really easy to access, but now is a little harder to access, but it's still open, theoretically open to the public. If you jump through a bunch of hoops, you can get in there and see it. And there's even some people who will take you on guided tours of it. This is not the original site of the tombstones, but some of the church where the tombstones were was torn down, and they put the tombstones together into one sort of area. That's why you can see behind this one tombstone, there's a whole bunch of other ones that are all next to each other. But it's still a very evocative area, place, and shows you the deep and long history here. So Matteo Ricci, I just put these dates up here just so you can orient yourself roughly. Italian, born in 1552, died in 1610 in Beijing. He arrived in Macau, which is a Portuguese colony, or was a Portuguese colony, in 1582, and you could say that was the beginning of his mission work. But in terms of, say, making it up to the capital, that was 1601. He was the first European ever to enter, at least that we know of, to enter the Forbidden City. Marco Polo came earlier in another dynasty. Some debate whether he actually ever came to China, etc. But Matteo Ricci, for sure, 1601, and the first permanent presence of Christianity in China. So since then, there has been Christianity in China. And so I think you can sort of date that back 420 years. There's a flowering of Christianity in China early on. The Ming Dynasty, which lasted until 1644, and then the Qing Dynasty initially were quite welcoming to the Jesuits. Here's a picture of Adam Chalfant Bell. He allowed or got the emperor to agree to open churches in China, portrayed it as a non-threatening religion that was not in conflict with Chinese culture at all. And so he's credited with having baptized 500,000 Chinese. Obviously, he didn't do that himself. Within 14 years. And like Ricci, he was a proponent of inculturation. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, this is the idea that the church, when it moves to a new culture, a new area of the world, it should try to fit in and should try to take parts of the culture that are not incompatible, that are compatible with Christian teaching, and not try to sort of clear cut all the local cultural practices and beliefs, but try to fit in as much as possible. And you can see here, Chalfant Bell is dressed as a Chinese official of that era with the, this is a phoenix on his gown in front of him, and he has around him the astronomical equipment that he brought, because at that time, Europe was beginning to actually move ahead of China technologically. I don't think China quite realized it, but Europe was at the beginning of this amazing technological push forward. And on a very practical basis, many of the courts, the calendars didn't always work 100% right, because they put a lot of stock in when there would be, say, an eclipse, when there would be a certain astronomical event. And the Jesuits could bring the latest European technology and accurately predict these. And the Chinese astronomers did not always get it right. So this gave them great standing in the court. They were able to bring in other technologies as well, and also even oil painting, some Italian-style chiaroscuro, shading. And so you have these very interesting paintings that you can see from that time that the Jesuits brought with them. so this was the Jesuits then had enemies in Rome, and there was this big event came up. This a central event in the church's history in China was the rights controversy. And the fundamental question that I write there at the top is, did many Chinese practices, especially ancestor worship, constitute religious practice? Is this religion, or is this just a cultural practice that you go to somebody's grave, to your mother's grave, your father's grave, your grandfather's grave, your ancestors' graves, and kowtow, light incense, offer food, etc., etc.? If that's religion, then you're worshiping somebody other than God. You're worshiping your ancestors. If it's just a cultural practice, it could be acceptable. The Jesuits were very generous in how they defined it. They said, no, this is just a cultural practice. It's not religious. Others disagreed. And the Jesuits basically lost the argument. And they then the church then said, no, these are antithetical to Catholic teaching, and the Pope then sent a letter to the emperor and said, you must cease and desist ancestor worship, or we're going to essentially excommunicate you, or they weren't really, the emperor was not a Christian, but we're going to pull out of China. And the emperor was outraged and said, we're banning Christianity because this is just an unbelievably fresh thing that you're claiming here. How dare you? Who the heck are you anyway on the other side of the world, sending me this letter saying what I can and cannot do, and saying that I should overturn millennia old practices that are bedrock parts of Chinese culture and religion? I would agree that actually ancestor worship is a kind of religion. I think that probably that was correct, and it probably is somewhat antithetical to Christianity. But certainly the Jesuit approach, and you can see it in this picture here of Confucius. Confucius was portrayed as a wise sage, not as a person who was really venerated and worshipped as a god, which he sometimes was actually in China. But they just said he's the sort of first sage of China, a wise person like, say, Aristotle or something like that. And so that's how they tried to portray it. They lost that battle, and Christianity, in this case, Christianity and Catholicism were synonymous, was banned in 1711. So just 100 years after Matteo Ricci got there, it was banned, but it did not go away. And that's why it's still important to say that Christianity had a permanent presence. It just went underground. It stayed alive in villages. It did not have patronage anymore. It became, to some degree, part of the Chinese religious landscape, almost like a folk religion, where the Virgin Mary was worshipped much as, say, the Buddhist goddess of mercy, Guanyin, was worshipped. Not to say that people were unaware of Christian teachings or they didn't read the Bible and that it was purely just a folk practice, but it became somewhat similar. And you had Catholic villages all around Beijing, in Hebei province, Shanxi province, which is spelled almost the same, Shandong, but it was sort of, you could think of this as a decapitation. You no longer had the connection to Rome, and you no longer had the hierarchical structure inside China. So it continued to grow the Catholic. Well, it grew much along with the population growing. As the villages grew and sometimes divided, people kept their Catholic faith, but it was no longer supported by the state or tolerated by the state. It was illegal. There were efforts by missionaries to come in, and there were many missionaries who did come in, sometimes risking death, and they had to stayed in the villages, undercover in people's homes, almost as if they were under house arrest, but they were able to spread the teaching, or improve people's understanding of Christianity, and that all happened in the 1700s and the early 1800s. this so as I said, it was banned until about 1860. And then you have the Second Opium War. The Second Opium War, don't need to get into a big Chinese history lesson, but you had disputes over how open China should be. The British were trying to sell opium to China, and the Chinese didn't want it. And the British then beat China in one war in 1839, 1840, and then along with France in a second war. And as part of this, the French insisted that the missionaries be allowed to return to China. So you had a shift in Catholicism from being underground and very inculturated. So it was very much part of Chinese society. As I said, there were missionaries, but they were kind of working hand in hand with the lay people. There was no feeling that, oh, you're coming from Rome, and I have to listen to everything you say, because after all, you're living in my house, and if I turn you into the authorities, you could have your head cut off, or at least be expelled from China. So there was a much more parity. After 1860, you had a huge influx of missionaries, including Protestant missionaries as well, who began, and the church then was able to mobilize. And I think this is probably one of the great strengths of the Catholic Church, that it is a global institution. It can mobilize the global church and send people to China to build orphanages, schools, hospitals, and of course, churches. Here is one of the churches built from that era, from the 19th century, in Shanxi province. And it's built in the European style, with maybe, as if you look inside, I'll show you some other pictures later, it has some local elements to it, but built much more in the European style. You had the concept of extraterritoriality, which means that the Europeans who were operating in China at that time were not subject to Chinese law. So this created some bad feelings, and there was a huge increase in the number of missionaries, but actually a quite slow increase in the number of Catholics and also of Protestants at this time. The number of Christians only increased at a very slow rate, so that by the early 19th century, people were thinking, what happened? Why did we fail in China? Why did Christianity why has it not taken root? Have we done something wrong? And this third point that's up on the slide, rice Christians, this is this idea that people in China converted just to get the handouts that the church was offering, such as rice, in a famine, or to get the free medical care, or to get the education, but they weren't really 100% buying into the faith. So this was perhaps one of the reasons that in some ways the huge influx of missionaries, because it was such a top-down function and it was accompanied by these kind of imperialistic ideas like extraterritoriality, that the church did not really take off and grow that strongly in this period. There's a very nice study done of a Catholic village in Catholicism in China, which I've always had my students read, and I know Mark has read this book also, called The Missionaries' Curse and Other Tales of a Chinese Catholic Village. And the author, Henrietta Harrison from Oxford University, she posits that basically you did have an increase in the number of Christians, but when there was any sort of oppression, most of those people who had converted for things like the free benefits, they fell away very quickly. And what you were left with was the bedrock of these villages, the people who had been Christian for generations and generations, since Matteo Ricci's time, and who felt that this was really their religion, and that it was that they were not converting because some European missionaries or Western missionaries had come and set up shop all of a sudden in the wake of their country's military defeat. This then of course, communists take over in 1949, and everything changes once again. And you have then the second, call it almost a second decapitation of the church in China. These were attacks in the Mao era. Catholicism and all religions were attacked in the Mao era, but I think Catholicism was hit especially hard. Here you have some pictures of what are called struggle sessions with priests, and down below a mass rally. Some of the great churches that were built at that time were turned into living museums, and the priests and nuns were held in cages, and people had to walk through the church. The local residents were forced to walk through the church and see this, and there would be people haranguing the priests and nuns, and said this is a symbol of China's oppression, and this was feudal superstition, this was backward, and it had to be destroyed. I think Catholicism was hit especially hard because it, as a religion that's organized hierarchically, if you do not have the input from if you don't have the connections to Rome, then it's hard to do things like consecrate bishops. And so what the communists did instead is they set up what are called patriotic religious organizations. And these patriotic religious organizations, and there are patriotic religious organizations for all religions in China, but they, in the case of Catholicism, essentially tried to replace the Catholic Church and said, okay, we will appoint the bishops in the different regions and parts of China. And this was rejected then by pious Catholics who said, well, wait a minute, the secular officials in Beijing can't appoint bishops. You have to have the concept of apostolic succession. It has to be appointed by the Vatican. And so these bishops are not legitimate, and therefore even the priests under them are not legitimate. We're not going to these churches. And so this started the rise of the underground church in China with its own bishops and its own priests. And it still is been quite vibrant in China, but has, this has been affected by this agreement with the Vatican. But in the Mao era and in the whole of the communist era, you had these patriotic associations that were supposed to control the church, and that caused this schism between the underground and the above ground church. And this is not to say that all above ground church leaders are stooges of the Communist Party, are not pious people. Many of them were approved by the Vatican, sometimes subsequently after the Vatican did its own checks, sometimes even ahead of time. There have been, so there are many people in the above ground church who are perfectly legitimate, and in many places in China, it's quite regional. The above ground church dominates. In other parts of China, the underground church dominates. And it has often to do with the specifics of the local history as to why that is. Since 1978, so there's been this revival. I think for the church, one of the big challenges is how to deal with migration. China is urbanizing rapidly, and these historically Catholic villages that I mentioned are emptying out. People are moving to the big cities to look for work as factory workers, as construction workers, etc. There's almost no money in agriculture in China, just as in other parts of the world as well. Agriculture just doesn't pay very well, and so they leave. And the question for the church then is how to get a piece of this religious. So on the one hand, you have the churches, the villages, the Catholic villages emptying out, people moving to the big city. This religious revival, this return of spirituality, the searching for meaning in life. What else is there in life besides making money? prosperity and all that is great. We're glad we're richer than we were before, but what are the values that unite society, and what should we believe in? How does the church get a piece of that religious revival when its historic areas are emptying out? One way would be to have outreach and mission work in the big cities where the people are arriving. But I think the church has been hampered by that because of the schism, because it has a great deficit in the number of bishops. There are dozens of bishops who have not been appointed. That has sort of paralyzed the church in some ways. And so the number of, oh, that's not a very good picture. Let me get to that in a second. The number of Catholics in China has basically tracked population growth since 1949. That, in other words, in 1949, there were 1 million Protestants and 3 million Catholics. And today, the best estimate is that there are roughly 10 million, 12 million at the very most, but probably more likely 10 million Catholics. And that's based on demographic work that's been done by researchers in Hong Kong and in the church, who look at the number of baptisms, the number of deaths, etc., and they can sort of extrapolate. And they also do some, calling and checking just to test their hypotheses. But it does seem that the number of Catholics in China has, at best, stagnated and could even be slightly declining because of this. Schism in the church. And this is sort of sets the stage, I think, for the church's efforts to forge a deal with Beijing in order to help the church revitalize itself today. I wanted to show you a couple of pictures of one of these historically Catholic villages. This is people who I interviewed. I did an article in the church for America Magazine, which you can probably find just by Googling my name in America Magazine. And these people who I spent some time with, some friends of theirs brought this back from when they made a pilgrimage to Rome. And this is for them, of course, highly significant. I'll just show you, this is a pilgrimage to one of the holy mountains. I assume this is going to show okay, showing a video over Zoom. Yeah, I mean, I found just the number of people involved going up this mountain. You can see in behind the valley below with the people. Wait, that's the same picture actually. That's and this is the same group of people at Stations of the Cross as they're making their way up the hill. Catholicism, and this is the official above ground church. This was a pilgrimage that was organized from a neighboring province, and people all got on buses and came to the village of Dongargo in Shenxi province, which is roughly 350 miles southwest of Beijing in a neighboring province. And there is still very strong piety. This is one of my favorite banquet scenes with the picture of the Last Supper there, and the priest who came with the worshipers who then celebrated Mass. This is a picture in the same village of a wedding. You can see the couple is in the foreground with their backs to us. The bride is wearing a traditional red wedding dress, and the groom is wearing the white checked shirt. That's not their child in front of them, but it's a big family event. And in the courtyard, they're sort of mixing Christianity or some Christian symbols and ideas with tradition. This is, I think it must be the groom's parents who are sitting facing them, flanking a picture of Jesus, and they are about to go and kowtow before the picture of Jesus and to kowtow to the parents, which is a very traditional way of showing your respect that now you're part of the family. So you see this lived, still very vibrant Christianity in China. This picture, not so great. Unfortunately, the slide cut it off. This is a mega Catholic church that's being built in a different part of China on the coast in Fujian province. This is the advantage of playing ball with the government. If you are in the official church, the government will build a giant new church for you like this. It's, I see, modern architecture, and the slide is unfortunately cut off the top of the steeple, goes up to the left, and there's a big cross on the top. It was still under construction when I went and visited. But this is not coincidental that they're building this, because this area is called Mindong, and it's an area where the underground church is extremely active. And so the church, the official church, is trying to lure the underground Christians to the official church by saying, look, we've got these wonderful new churches, and you guys are still in these old small churches and in people's homes and stuff like that. Come to us. This is another official church, an older one, but still, it's a real sort of proper church, and behind is an organ, and it's got all the things you would expect. This is a local shrine in the village. This is the underground church in this area. And it's quite, so, you say it's the underground church, but they've still built a big building, and they have money, and they have been tolerated by the state up until recently. And hence we get to the agreement with the Vatican, which was meant to solve the problem of how bishops are consecrated. Here is a picture of the underground bishop who works in this diocese. So this is his headquarters. I interviewed him, and so as part of the agreement, he's supposed to, and some of the underground bishops are supposed to step aside in favor of bishops who have been approved by Beijing, who are with the above ground church, but who the Vatican has also agreed are okay and acceptable. And so there's been an effort to solve, from the government's point of view, to solve the problem of the underground church by saying, look, all of the churches now, so including the above ground, the government approved bishop who will be in this church in the future when it's built. It probably is already finished. I took this picture a couple of years ago. He is just as legitimate as the underground bishop. And indeed, this underground bishop has stepped aside in favor of the government's bishop. So this is, for some people in the community, difficult to accept, because they've been following the underground church for decades and decades, because it's the true church. And now the Vatican's saying, hey, actually the above ground church is now okay. We've given it our approval. And from the government's point of view, this will eliminate the need to even tolerate an underground church, because you don't really need to have an underground church if the above ground church has been approved by the Vatican. From the Vatican's point of view, they're hoping they can speed up the number of bishops who are being consecrated. This will help revitalize the church's structure in China and help make it able to deal with all of these issues, such as urbanization and reaching out to the community. People often ask what I think of the deal, or what people, how one should look at this. I think both sides, the only problem with this kind of an agreement is that both sides have different goals. From the government's point of view, their goal is to control the church, to make sure that all the bishops are approved by Beijing. From the Vatican's point of view, it's to revitalize the church. But the problem is the government, of course, has no intention, doesn't want to revitalize religion. It wants to maybe at best tolerate it and control it, but it doesn't want to revitalize it and allow for a flourishing of religious life. But of course, it is a gambit the church probably felt it had to take, given the stagnating number of Catholics who were who exist in China today. So with that, I think I'll just stop screen sharing, and we can go back. I've been talking now for 45 minutes. I think that's more than enough, and I can see there are a lot of people who have questions. Might be most efficient to switch to that phase.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of great information. We have a lot of great questions here. The first one, which I like to answer, is that I like to ask is, or answer, I don't know, is the tomb of Matteo Ricci still located in a garden in the middle of the Communist Party school in Beijing? Last visited in 2007. I actually went there with you, Ian, when I was in China with you. Is it still in a Beijing Communist Party school?
Yeah, well, you recall it was, right? And we had to go in through the front gate. So it is. The party occupied this territory, this land, this piece of land, which had been really, the back part of it was church property. And there are still some remnants of that we looked at afterwards. It took over that well, I don't know if it was exactly in 1949, but the church had been destroyed earlier. The church had been destroyed in the Taiping uprising around the turn of the century. Not the Taiping, the Boxer uprising around the turn of the century. And then there was this cemetery there, and they consolidated the cemetery. It is still located there. And you can get in, but you have to register ahead of time. And it's sort of, you can't just walk up to the gate and go, hey, I want to go see the Jesuit cemetery. You have to have registered ahead of time. There's a very nice person in charge of that who handles it, but it is helpful if you're planning to do this, to get a Chinese-speaking person to do this ahead of time, fax the particulars or email. China's still a place that does faxes, but send the particulars of who's going to go, and maybe copies of your passport and stuff like that, and then they'll have you on record at the front gate. Because you have to think, the party school is kind of a weird location. The party school is the indoctrination center for all of the party officials in Beijing. So this is an absolutely crucial area. They don't want foreigners just wandering around going, hey, what are you guys teaching here? Interesting. Let me stop in on this class on Marxism, Leninism or something. So they want to make sure that you go there, and then you go to the cemetery and you can look around, and there's even an old guy. Was that old guy on our trip? There's this old guy. Yeah, he sort of has a hobby, tour guide thing that he does kind of for free, but sometimes you take him out for dinner afterwards or something like that, and he can show you around the place as well. So I think it's still accessible, but getting increasingly bureaucratic to get in.
I remember he had like a book that he made that could show us.
To show pictures. Yeah.
Show pictures. This question is a little bit out of the purview of what we were talking about, but it came up when you were talking about the different religions in China. What was and if you don't know anything about this, feel free to say that also. What was the governmental reason for excluding Judaism from the official list of religions? There have been Jews in Western China for centuries. Obviously, the official list is so short, but it seems like an odd omission.
Yeah, it is odd. Basically, this started even before the communists took power. After the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, the Republic of China decided they wanted to organize religions in church-like structures. So in some kind of a hierarchical organization, because the modern state always wants to have an interlocutor. Like, I want to talk to Muslims. Who do I talk to? I want to talk to Catholics. Who do I talk to? I want to talk to whatever Buddhists. Who do I talk to? I can't just have like a bunch of temples and stuff like that. So they began to ask the religions and began to organize associations. So there was the Taoist Association. There was even a Confucian association, which is maybe even more of an interesting question. Confucianism never made it as a religion either. And these religious organizations coalesced in the 1920s and 30s when the communists took power. They assumed this. Now, Judaism existed, especially in the city of Kaifeng, for many centuries. It's well documented. There's even models of what the synagogue looked like. It, by and large, died out. And this is the state. I mean, if you go to Kaifeng, there are still people who say they are descendants of the Jews of Kaifeng, and I believe them. But the state of Israel has a commission that it sends out to communities around the world, especially say in Africa or say in Ethiopia or something. They say, "Oh, we're one of the we're a Jewish community," and they will send people there, send this commission there, and evaluate the situation and say, "Is there actually living Judaism?" So the last rabbi died in something like 1875. There is no ability in the community for people to read Hebrew or to carry out religious ceremonies. So the state of Israel decided that that there is no living Jewish community in China anymore. That this is a historical, say, relic. That there are still some people, etc. Now there are some of these people who have gone to Israel and learned Hebrew and so on and so forth, and come back to China. It raises the bigger question of it's not just Judaism, it's also Hinduism. I mean, there are Hindus living in China now because of business, Indian business people who go to China. And there are Jews, American and other countries, Jewish people from these countries who go to China and live there long term. And they can't open a synagogue, or they can't reclaim the historic synagogue in Shanghai because the government only allows these 5 groups. And I think the reason for this is that they're worried about opening a can of worms. If they allow in Judaism, they'd have to allow in Hinduism, they'd have to allow in any number of other religious groups. Maybe folk religion in China should actually be a religion rather than being defined as it is now as a sort of cultural practice. So the government has just said, no, there's just going to be these 5 groups. We'll be pragmatic about it. If you're a Hindu or you're a Jew and you want to practice at home, or you want to rent out a ballroom in a hotel for a holy day, you can do that. We're not going to oppose that, but there's no mission work allowed, and you have to kind of just stay in your community. So that's why they keep it like that.
Mm-hmm. The second question is, this next question is actually, I haven't even thought of this question before. Is it not an irony that the communists tried to eradicate influence of Confucius and are now trying to incorporate parts of it into the communist sense of sinification? Are there any Christian groups, particularly foreign Protestant groups, that are trying to enculturate with the basic communist message? The World Council of Churches in the 50s and 60s compared Maoism with the march of Christianity in the world. I guess the question are there church missionaries trying to take the positive values of communism and incorporating it into the Christian message? I feel like any kind of communitarian construction is using the basic values of communism, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know of any that are explicitly doing that. I do think that there are groups that do charity work in China, and they see this as sort of similar. So there's foundations that the official church runs, for example, and they say, hey, this is just part of doing good works, which is something the Communist Party supports. So I think in that sense, they try to fit in. I mean, this idea of say, social engagement, social work is quite common in Christianity, and other religions in China have emulated it. So you find that after disasters, or when there's some kind of a flood or something like that, the churches are usually quite active in trying to help out, but so are now the Buddhists and the Taoists and so on. But what was the first part of the question? There was or was it, or do we answer it?
Yeah, no, you got it. You're great.
Okay. All right.
Um, all right. A question I have specifically for you, Ian, that I think would be good for people who want to learn more about this issue. I feel like there's a lot of weird sources out there about China and the Christian church and Christians in China. Just what would be some reputable sources to learn more about China instead of going to like
YouTube.
ChinaFacts.com and if you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
where would you go for authentic information about religion policy in China, what's happening in China?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think we live in an era of information overflow. There are good sources of news on China is UCAN. What does that stand for? Is it United Catholic Asia News or something like that? They're based in Hong Kong. They do real reporting in China. They talk to people. They call up members of the church, and they have good people who write and work for them. There are, I think you have to. There are many good books that have been written on Catholicism in China that I would recommend for people who want background information on the church. And I could send you, or you probably know some of them yourself, Mark, but I mean, I think you probably know. But I mean, I think otherwise I would just go to normal established sources of information. I don't think China Source, they're more focused on Protestantism, I think, but they have, there's the Religion News Service, which is good. I would be wary of people who have YouTube shows and, just sort of are commenting and riffing. I think in general, it's like doing due diligence on anything, any source of information, but I would say, does this person have real expertise in the area? Has the person, say, lived in China? Do they, or are they just commenting? Are they just, there's been a lot of commentary around, say, the agreement with the Vatican. And there are two sides that, and people can legitimately debate this, but there's a lot of people who take quite extreme positions without ever having actually been to China. They say it's a sellout and stuff like that. And with which I think is, something you find. There is obviously debate in the church over the efficacy of this agreement, but I think it's somehow a little unfair when people are just taking pot shots and they have absolutely no real knowledge of the situation at all on the ground. So I would just look for people who have some real expertise.
We have two versions of the same question. Why, in your opinion, have the Protestants been so much more successful that growing the Christian faith in the Catholic Church over the last 100 years? And then how can you explain that the Protestant churches are still growing so fast compared with the indigenous religions in China? Those churches don't have a lot of rituals like the Roman Catholic Church and have a kind of poverty in rituals. Why? So essentially, why, in your view, I mean, this is a huge question, but like, why would you think Protestant churches are growing faster than other Christians or other communities in China?
Yeah, the Protestant church has grown indeed very quickly, from 1 million in 1949 to, I'd say conservatively 40, 50, 60 million today. That's a high rate of growth. And some people have higher numbers, but I don't think that's really backed up by solid information. Some people say 100 million or something like that. I don't know. These numbers are sort of pulled out of the air. Suspicious. All these numbers are round numbers and they're guesstimates, but I think it's safer to have. But anyway, it's grown quickly. I think the reason is that Protestantism, as somebody said, ritual poor, a sort of weak hierarchical, weak structural religion, has the potential to grow quickly, not always in good ways. In some ways, there's a lot of autodidacts. I did in the book I wrote on religion in China. One of my case studies was a Protestant pastor in Chengdu, in the southwestern city of Chengdu. And I did a lot of interviews with him in 2012, 2013, 14, 15. He had just converted 10 years earlier to Christianity.
Mm.
And in typical fashion, he'd sort of memorize the Bible, and could sort of like quiz you, on what's in John 10, whatever. I was like, I don't know. Then you're not a real Christian. And he was a dynamic, powerful, charismatic figure. He had been known before as a human rights lawyer. And then it started as a house church just in somebody's living room. And then they got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And as a charismatic speaker and a very intelligent person, a great storyteller, he attracted a big following. And by the time I was interviewing him 10 years later, he had 400 or 500 people in his church. Now, this wouldn't be possible really in the Catholic Church. You couldn't just, like Mark can't just like start a church and because he gives great sermons, everyone goes to it and says, okay, I'm starting a new Catholic Church of St. Mark or something like that. And then it's like, whoa, the Catholic Church has some problems with that. But in Protestantism, who's going to regulate it, right? There's nobody. And later, an interesting point though with some of these Protestant churches is they begin to search for denominations. They begin to say, we actually need some structure. We need to, so what do we think of infant baptism? Is that good? Is it bad? How do we approach these questions? And it turns out Christians have been thinking about these things for hundreds, thousands of years. And so they begin to look, and many of them then went to Reform Christianity, Calvinism, because they thought that was appropriate in the Chinese case. But I think it's just that there's a Chinese sociologist in Beijing, and he did a very interesting study. He looked at the model atheist counties in China. These are counties that in the Mao era had been declared atheist, and they had sort of clear cut a lot of the indigenous religions, and a lot of the temples have been destroyed. People have been forced to be atheists, and there had been no transmission of local religious life. And in those areas, it is in those areas where Protestantism grew the fastest. Because in Protestantism, again, you just need a guy with a Bible in the living room and you can sort of start a church. You don't need to have a lot of other things. And you can see this in areas that have had an intact religious life, say in Taiwan. Taiwan, despite the fact that in the Cold War, it was an American ally, and because of that, it opened its doors to missionaries, and also Chiang Kai-shek, who ran it, was also converted to Christianity or sympathetic to Christianity. And when I was in Taiwan studying, Mormons would be coming knocking on the door a couple times a month, trying to baptize people and stuff like that. Despite that, Christianity is only about 5% of the population, because the other religious life had not really been affected. In a place like South Korea, which had had a lot of turmoil, and for various historical reasons, the last dynasty had been against Buddhism because they thought it was a rival, and it sort of tried to knock back Buddhism. And for other reasons as well, during the colonial era, the Buddhist temples and structures had allied themselves with the Japanese. Protestantism took off in this culture, this era of cultural ferment and destruction. And so about 30% of South Koreans are Christians today. So I think it's a complex question. I think in China, the church would probably never have been able to compete with that kind of Protestantism. But I think it can probably still do better, and probably will do better in the future.
You brought up, so I'm gonna have us go for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we're finishing up.
Absolutely.
The last few. We have about 9 more questions, but we'll get as many as we can. You brought up Taiwan. Does the Catholic Church in Taiwan have serious concerns about Rome's commitment to them as a result of the Beijing Vatican agreement?
So far, there's been no talk of cutting off diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing. Honestly, I think the church would probably do that if it got far enough along. I think that's probably way off in the future. And given the difficulties in implementing the agreement and the overall crackdown on religion and so on and so forth, I think that's probably way off in the future.
Does the government keep track of who is Christian in China? How does the government monitor the church in China? Is there a government representative at services? You talked a little bit about the Patriotic Association. I don't think you were with me, but I visited their seminary. It was
This is
definitely.
I'm going to show a picture. Just Oh wait, maybe I don't have this picture. Okay, never mind. I don't have the picture there. I thought I had that picture. No, I had a picture of a cave, which is a shrine to the Virgin Mary, and there's a statue of Mary up in the corner. You look up, and behind it is a closed circuit television camera looking down at all the people who are worshiping. So you're not really sure who's looking down at you. And of course, they would say, oh, it's just, to make sure there's no defacement or to make sure everything's safe, there's blah, blah, blah. But it's not, I don't think it takes a George Orwell to think that with facial software recognition growing by leaps and bounds, that if they can't do it already within a year or two, they could probably tell who's going into this shrine. They're putting up closed circuit televisions everywhere in China, just as they are in many Western countries. In London and so on, I think has a much more closed circuit television. But I think the problem in China, of course, is that there's no data protection, and they could find out who's going to churches. For some people it won't matter, but if you're, say, working in a state-owned enterprise, and there are a lot of the economy in China is still state-controlled. Say you work for Sinopec, the big petroleum company, and on Sundays you go to church. If you're about to be promoted, say, to be division head, they may say, we noticed you go to the church every Sunday. Do you really need to do that so much? Because if you're going to be promoted, we don't want somebody whose allegiances are not with the state or something like that. So it could work against you. And of course, it could have a chilling effect on people who want to go to church if you feel that everything's being videotaped. I don't think there's a high consciousness or awareness of that in China, but I think that potential is there.
There's been speculation on the secrecy of the China-Vatican deal, including not allowing Chinese citizens under 18 to practice the faith, and the Vatican taking payments directly from the CCP to cover operating losses, mostly due to the church's abuse scandal payouts. Have there been any debunking or confirmation of these accusations?
I can't believe that the Vatican is taking money from China. I mean, this is just, I think in some cases you have to just say, well, wait a minute, can we have some proof on the other side first? So this strikes me as outlandish. So I don't think that in terms of minors worshiping, people can still children can still go to church. I think the government, though, does have a policy that it's only adults are supposed to practice religion. So far, that hasn't resulted in Sunday schools closing down. Now, whether that changes in the future, I don't know. I think the government right now is in high control freak mode over the past, say, 5 or 10 years. It's almost like this cyborg that keeps trying to control more and more aspects of society. It passed a non-governmental organization, an NGO law, it passed a religion law, but I don't think that it would go to that level. I think there'd be huge pushback from Christians if they couldn't bring children to church. Anecdotally, that I can see that happening, but you have to also remember China is a huge, diverse place. Just as in the United States, you can find an anecdote to support anything. The question is whether it's commonly practiced in China. I think you'd have to prove that first. This is also another thing in terms of evaluating news in China. China is the same size as the United States, and it's got dialects that are as varied as French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. In other words, they are related, but they're mutually incomprehensible. There's a huge amount of stuff going on in China, and there are a lot of people have vested interest in cherry picking bits of information to support this or that pet theory that they have.
Yeah, my go-to thing whenever I think about China is that take what you're reading and then make it 10 times more complex, and that's probably what. Right. Do you think that the Chinese state would ever target Christians or Catholics like currently being done to the Uyghurs?
Well, I think Christianity is a challenge to the party in a different way. Christianity, in the case of the Uyghurs, it's bound up also in ethnic separatism and independence movements, and not being a part of China, not being culturally the same as China. The challenge of Christianity is that you have ethnic Chinese people, so Han Chinese. And China has 56 ethnic groups. One of them, which makes up 90% of the population, are ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese. But Christianity is in that group. So you can't just say, oh, it's a minority group. They're on the fringes of China. It's sort of a problem of asserting control over a geographic area. Christians are embedded in Chinese culture. They are in all regions of China, of traditional heartland China: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Chengdu, Xi'an. All these big cities have vibrant Christian communities. So I think it'll be harder for the government to do something like they're doing in Xinjiang, but I can see that Christianity will remain, from their perspective, a headache that they have to somehow deal with.
I also think that the international, due to cultural ties to Christian communities, might be swift to, if anything like that started happening. So we're coming near the end of our time here. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions here, but the last one I want to ask, because I think it ties neatly into your book, how does the Chinese party respond to this religious revival? With the revival of Confucian values by the government, is this their way of offering some sort of value system to account for this spiritual vacuum?
Yeah, the government has tolerated religious life in China. I think under the previous administration in the 2000s, under Hu Jintao, there was more of a willingness to say, hey, these ideas are sometimes not incompatible with what we're trying to do also, to instill moral values or to give people something to hold on to, some positive values in society, because not everyone's going to believe in communism. But I think that the government now is in more of a conundrum where they feel that this is, yes, that's a possible role of religion, but it can also be a challenge to us. And this is the eternal challenge that authoritarian states face, that they are always looking over their shoulder. They are never feeling confident. They're always seeing enemies where there aren't necessarily enemies. And they look at how communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, and they see the role of the Catholic Church in Poland or the Protestant Church in East Germany, or trade unions in Poland like Solidarity, and they see potential problems. And I think this is a sign really of a lack of confidence and weakness, but this is the overarching feeling in China today, that, and by the party, that it's surrounded by potential enemies. And so the urge to control, I don't think, is going to diminish over time.
Perfect. Well, that's all the time we had for today. Thank you, Ian. Ian, you can find his books wherever books are sold. And feel free to join us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. I put the link in the chat for our program on racial justice from 3 Catholic perspectives. So thank you, and feel free to log off when you want to. I don't really know how they end.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thanks for all the great questions, and nice talking to you. Have a good evening. Bye.